Buenas tardes,
Good
gracias por...
afternoon, and thank you for joining us in this live broadcast of the press conference for the World Bank. I am Jessica Belmont. I'm going to be one of your hosts, and today we're going to discuss the report Renewing with Growth. This report is one of various presented by the World Bank, and we convey greetings from Mexico City and Montevideo. We are in virtual connection with Martin Rama, our chief economist, who is going to discuss this in more detail. Good afternoon, Martin. How are you? Good afternoon, Jessica. Pleasure to be here. Well, thank you very much for joining us and for taking this time. Martin, I just wanted to mention that we have various journalists throughout the region who are going to be present at the press conference. And I'd just like to take this opportunity to convey greetings and thank them for joining us in this broadcast. I also like to mention that we have simultaneous interpretation into Spanish, English, Portuguese, and French. If anyone would like to just select the language of your choice, just click on the globe icon in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. We're going to talk now about the report, Renewing with Growth. This was prepared by Martin's team that will discuss how Latin American countries really fared during this pandemic, both in the healthcare as well as the economic and social fronts. This report also addresses the economic forecasts of the various nations, and it also examines some specific sectors that did experience some growth and prosperity during the pandemic and have great potential for generating further growth in the region as the region recovers from the crisis. So we're going to follow this process. First, Martin is going to give a brief description of the principal findings of the report. Then we will have some Q&A. We've already received some questions in advance, but you'll also be able to ask some other questions as the presentation unfolds. Now, please share these, except where we will have a Q&A. Make sure that during the Q&A, you submit them through the chat. And if we don't have enough time to respond to all the questions, we will follow them up by just sending email questions. So you can follow the discussion through social media or join us through hashtag, uh, and that is hashtag Perspectivas LAC. So, Martin, it really is incredible, but it was exactly a year ago that we were already online holding this press briefing online, just as the pandemic had begun. We never imagined that exactly a year later we would continue to be doing these online discussions because of the restrictions. So, I just wanted to ask, 1 year into the pandemic, and based on your study, how have the Latin American countries fared in the midst of this pandemic, and what are some of the future economic perspectives for the region? Well, exactly. It was a year ago that we were already online thinking that we just had a few weeks of lockdown ahead of us. And at that time, the overall idea was that Latin America was responding fairly quickly. We saw what was going on in Italy, what was going on in Spain, and we thought that we were poised to deal with the pandemic, and we thought that the major impacts were going to take place in less developed countries because of the weaknesses of their healthcare systems, as well as institutional weaknesses. But now, a year later, it's very clear that Latin America and the Caribbean were the regions most hardly affected by the pandemic because of the number of cases of deaths, as well as the level of economic losses and the drop in their share of GDP. So we're trying to look at some comparable measures. We look at, for example, mortality rates from COVID. What we're seeing is that countries, based on, because of their different monitoring tools and mechanisms, some countries do more systematic tests than others. And so instead of looking at the official death statistics, we look at we're comparing how many people passed away in 2020 compared to a normal year. in other words, an average over the last 5 years. And when we do that kind of study, we see that Latin America and the Caribbean wasn't just doing that badly. It was actually worse. The ratio between one death attributed to COVID and the additional numbers of deaths was about 30% more. But in Latin America, it's almost 90% more, making it much worse. So we can imagine that, well, maybe this is because in the poor countries, you don't have reliable statistics and we don't have any way of comparison. Not all countries have mortality statistics. But when we look at the other countries that we can compare, we continue to find that ratio of about 30% additional deaths characterized by countries. And Latin America continues much higher, at much higher rates in mortality rates. In 2020, we had the worst uh, mortality rates in the Andean region. And then countries like Uruguay and Costa Rica, then 2020, had lower mortality rates. Now, that was in 2020. 2021, we're seeing new waves and new complications added to the mix. And so if we look at developing countries, which the regions that the World Bank classifies as underdeveloped regions, Latin America and the Caribbean are still faring worse than all the other regions. So it was a very difficult and challenging year for the region. So in our report, as we view the future, we ask ourselves, what's next? Thank you, Martin. And the name of the report is Renewing with Growth. So that leads me to think that we're hopeful that with this statement, this sentence, what is going to happen in Latin America and the Caribbean beyond 2021? Can this crisis also be seen as an opportunity? Well, let me just start off with 2021. 2021, when we look at some of the forecasts, we're looking at the forecasts from a year ago, and the drop in 2020 is greater than what we expected, and recovery levels in 2021 are also greater than what we had anticipated a year ago. So we're probably going to look at a very sharp V pattern, which is not, we're not going to completely return to normalcy, but we do see a major push forward. There are many reasons for us to be hopeful. There are three reasons why, and that's in the report, why this could be more than 1 year's challenges. 2021 is going to continue to be a COVID year, even with all of the vaccinations going on. We're not going to achieve herd immunity until after the end of this year. We're already in our second year of lockdown. Now, from here on, there are several reasons where we could be pessimistic. For example, when we look at human capital, many countries have had their doors shut. Young people have had to change their scheduling as far as learning. Most of them have to do distance learning, and and this is not online learning is not a substitute for in-person class attendance. So if we look at that impact on human capital, the World Bank statistics shows that this is one of the worst. This is impacting Latin America much worse than any other region because they've had longer periods of lockdowns. Also, we've seen a sharp drop in employment levels, more so for women than for men, for many reasons. Women worked more in personal services. Those are the areas where there have been greater shutdowns. And looking at the fact that women also have to be taking care of the household, being with their children. So we're seeing a major setback compared to previous levels. Also, we're seeing an increased indebtedness of the countries in the region, having, for example, programs to stimulate business, to stimulate families. Because of these things, Latin America and the Caribbean have become greatly indebted. Fortunately, the financial market continued to move forward, but we still have high levels of indebtedness, business as well. We're not even clear what has affected the businesses to what extent, because there's been a lot of postponement and moratorium on debt payment. So we're looking at some of the reasons, however, that we can also be optimistic. This is a period of significant infrastructure transformation. Some have shrunk, other sectors are expanding. Everything dealing with IT, we're seeing major expansion. We're seeing logistical expansions. We're seeing online banking expansions. And when we look at this, we're looking at how this is going to, well, in the short term, we know that we're seeing shrinkage. But as the economy comes out of this crisis, we're never going to go back to so-called normalcy. We've done some calculations to see how the changes in the ecosystem can also actually raise average levels of productivity. And one other question, Jessica, that I think needs to be addressed, the most important sector here is IT and communications technology, because it's not just a sector that has been moving forward. We can see changes in accessing to find your finances, accessing jobs, also informing on many we're getting much more reliable information as to how the economy is flowing. We can uh, we can now also communicate through many more platforms. So we're conducting a much more detailed analysis as a result about Latin America's progress toward digitalization. But of course, we see imbalances and asymmetries. About half of the people don't have very good access to internet services in most of the countries in the region. And then you have other countries that have made great strides in digital development. Well, just to conclude, if we look at the digital acceleration that you were talking about and the information technology, I think the report also introduces some other recommendations regarding this, I believe. Yes, the report doesn't really offer recommendations. This is a report that just has put these topics on the table for discussion, but there is one chapter, entire chapter, devoted to the whole idea of digitalization that suddenly we've seen disruptions, new changes that have allowed us to make advances where we were not sure this could be possible, especially in the area of economic policies, where we're seeing enormous transformation is in the energy sector, because we're seeing, look at, for example, new renewable energy sources that are being encouraged. And we see that Latin America has a major advantage. Well, Latin America and the Caribbean, but especially Latin America, they have the cleanest energy sectors. We have huge quantities of hydroelectric energy sources. We have enormous potential for wind energy, for solar energy. And with this kind of technology, if we become more efficient, we could have the cheapest electrical energy services in the world. This is important for families, it's important for creating new jobs, it's important for businesses. And yet right now we have the most expensive electricity, most expensive for families, most expensive for businesses. So the report asks, why? Why is this? We know that some of it has to do with surcharges and taxes. Of course, this has contributed to great inefficiencies. There are lots of inefficiencies, even in those countries that have strong regulatory mechanisms and organizations. So, can we make progress in these areas that are groundbreaking and new in terms of, for example, the distribution, where everyone can have their solar energy panels installed in their houses. They can sell or buy electricity, and that has an enormous potential, and it can be done well. Latin America is just embarking on this, but I think there's a lot of opportunity. The other area that's potential is the trade in electrical energy between countries. We've seen enormous strides in the last 10 to 15 years, and there are enormous possibilities that will generate cheaper energy and cleaner energy sources. Thank you, Martin, for this outlook that you've shared with us in the report, uh, Renewing with Growth. Now we're going to start off with a few questions from our media representatives. Now remember, the hashtag to join is hashtag Perspectivas LAC. So we're going to start with this question that I'm going to read, and this is from the from Teleglobo, from Brazil, and the question is, looking at Brazil's economic perspectives, especially in the worsening of the pandemic and the deterioration of the fiscal situation, And a second follow-up is if you think if it's okay. Yes, go ahead. The second question is it possible to quantify in economic terms the costs of the slow pace of the vaccination program in Brazil? Thank you very much. I think these are questions very specific to Brazil, but let me just point out that in the report, for those interested, in the final chapter, there is a summary for each one of the countries in the region. The summary is larger, of course, for Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico, the three largest economies in the region. But one interesting aspect regarding Brazil, actually two things that I think that help Brazil significantly. One had to do with the domestic policies. Externally, it one of the it's not a lot of good news, but this is one of the few good news items in 2020 was that the price of raw materials and food products and minerals, in fact, did not drop. They actually increased. So we're seeing this energy in the exports to Asia, for example, and we're seeing this in the agricultural sector that have responded very well because the prices have gotten better. Then the other aspect that really stands out in the case of Brazil is that the country implemented in a program to assist families, fairly comprehensive. And this year, if we look at the recovery levels in the region, poverty in the region hardly increased at all. And a large of that is attributed to what happened in Brazil and other countries as well. But of course, in Brazil, the program was much larger. We saw a determination by governments to support their citizens that in the end was very successful. But again, this had a lot to do with some of the fiscal measures. So it's one thing when you start a race where you're sprinting. It's another thing if you have to run a marathon. In this case, we are running a marathon race. And the vaccination program, as you said, is unfolding slowly. And I think our forecast has a lot of uncertainties. In the report, we monitor, of course, much more economic activity through satellite imagery, and that allows us to have an optimistic view as to what's going on during this first quarter of 2021. But there's still many uncertainties. The fiscal aspect at some point is going to require a certain point of consolidation, and we don't know when that's going to be. It's difficult to point that out. But right now, the interest rates globally continue to be very low, which also helps the situation, but it's something that we need to follow closely. Thank you, Martin. And just as you talked about the outlook, and I'm going to read this other question in case they wanted to add something, then we can move on. Lucian Carneiro from Valor Económicos, she says Brazil is one of the countries with the highest numbers of death attributed to COVID in the world. So, what does the pandemic? What are some of the messages and impact of the pandemic for Brazil in the long term, economically speaking? Well, I think it just gets back to what I said earlier. It's interesting for the readers of the report to look at how well the perspective we have of the country is different if we're looking at deaths attributed to COVID or excess death or mortality rates. I would say Brazil, when we look at that mortality rate, maybe it was not one of the countries most severely affected in the region. However, the second wave that Brazil is facing is a source of great concern. Well, now we have a question from Argentina, actually two, and I'm going to group some of these up. Anabela Quiroga from Clarín asks, when will the region recover, especially Argentina? When will they recover the level of employment that they had before the pandemic? The second question is from Sofia from the La Nación newspaper. How do you view the economic situation in Argentina, and how will this impact? Remembering that this year there's a new program being launched with the IMF. Well, as far as when we're going to recover previous economic and employment levels, it's something I would just like to answer in general. It's not that we were not in the best of economic situations when the pandemic hit for several years. Latin America had shown sluggish growth rates. The indices had been stagnant for a long time. So the idea of returning to where we were before the pandemic, that would be great if we could, but it's we're not going to achieve that. Some of the calculations that we're doing for the region as a whole is that because of the sluggish growth in the region, if you look at the per capita statistics, the drop that we faced in 2020 basically erased an entire decade in 1 year. Now, the good news is that we are recovering at a much faster pace than expected. And if we look at, we have a fairly robust methodology to measure, for example, levels of the carbon monoxide that comes or dioxide coming from factories and other businesses, that we have NASA imaging that we can more or less assess economic activities. But if we look at some of these areas, as we do in the report, during the first quarter of this year, a large part of the region is exactly the way it was in the last quarter of 2019. That would be some good news, but we have to be cautious because this is a approximation. If it turns out that nobody is taking mass transit because everybody's using their own cars, this could be that might be the reason we have more emissions. It can be deceiving, but there are some countries, Argentina, Ecuador, that entered the pandemic with a crisis already unfolding before that. So I think the situation there, in the case of Argentina, and as you mentioned, the mechanism established with the IMF and fiscal consolidation efforts, that would add a new dose of uncertainty to the enormous uncertainties we already see with the rest of the region. Well, thank you. Now that you mentioned how you conduct these studies with satellite imagery is very impressive. Let's move on to the next question. These questions are from Panama. There are two questions. One is from Arbela from El Estrella de Panama, and then Roberto Gonzalez from the La Prensa magazine, and Luis Sierra from Estrategia y Negocios publication. So the first question is, what is the perspective that you see in the short term for Panama in terms of economic recovery levels and the high level of indebtedness of that country to address budgetary shortfalls? And what about the budget levels that will determine, and working with a very low baseline when the country had suffered one of the greatest economic contractions in the region in 2019? Well, again, I don't want to get in too many details for each country individually, but Panama has a combination of circumstances that are both challenging for the recovery, but also in some cases promising. Challenging in the sense that Panama is a hub of communications and connections. It's a point where people transit constantly, and to maintain the level of flow and at the same time protect against contagion is difficult. And in the financial sector that can be energized looking in the forward with the structural changes, I think there Panama has an enormous potential. Now, looking at the indebtedness, that's something faced by just about every country. And some of the analyses that we do in the report, comparing this to the global financial crisis that seems fairly distant right now, but in this case, the drop was much more severe and starting at a much lower level. The fiscal issue from now on will be a key issue to consider for all of Latin America and the Caribbean. We have to address this correctly, and we need to take advantage of this time while interest rates are still low and there's low levels of inflation in order to scale up and not be any faced with any unpleasant surprises. So I think that should be a priority for all of the countries in the region.
AFP, Alina, asks the following. In the World Bank report, you point out that companies and homes are paying a lot more for electricity than for consumption and more than it costs to produce it. So what countries are facing a greater challenge as far as reducing the cost of electricity? And what about what would the appropriate institutional framework to be for bringing down the price of electricity or power in the region? The situation in countries is very heterogeneous. There are countries that have a very highly regulated power system that are very competitive, in which technically things were done in the best way possible. Even still, in some of them, our power markets are so small that there are monopolies among some of those generators. Now, on the other extreme, we have countries, especially in the Caribbean and Central America, in which we are far from having reached universal access to electricity. There are blackouts that undermine economic development and growth. And so it's quite a large spectrum of situations. You have those countries. So the basic conditions have to be set, but there is much complexity in the pricing system. All of the countries try to have affordable power rates for low-income families, but it's complicated. And in some cases, there are hidden costs in the rates. For example, if we have a power system in which the government owns the companies and also regulates the prices, those are situations that have to be corrected. Now, we place a stress on distribution because the risk there, we hope to see more competitive companies where you have companies and generators, and then you have for example, the sugar industry that draws on the electrical system. Now, that needs to be properly regulated, otherwise the problem's not going to be overcome. And the same thing happens with international trade. There are countries like Brazil that have much demand for electricity and could be satisfying that demand with clean forms of energy. In these cases, we try to come up with a mechanism to see at what price electricity is being purchased and sold at. That has been done in Europe quite well. And I think the right path forward is integration of the power system in Latin America. Well, thank you very much. We have one more country from El País, or country rather, from Mexico, Jose Avilar from Expansión. And Jose asks, what is your outlook for economic growth in Mexico? What needs to be done from the federal government and private initiative to go back to pre-pandemic levels? Thank you. Now, there's a large portfolio focused on Mexico. Unlike other countries in Latin America, there has been less fiscal stimulus in Mexico, and that has made the situation a bit more difficult for families, but it keeps the fiscal situation more manageable. And so there are costs and benefits to those approaches. Now, looking forward, in which there could be a favorable situation for Mexico, value chains that don't depend on Asia primarily, as the just-in-case approach is like just in time, and Mexico is one of the countries that's best positioned, given its proximity to the US, to avail itself of that. Now, to conclude with Mexico, Miguel Ramirez from Negocios y Finanzas. I would like to know, how has the recovery of jobs been in Mexico, the economy? You've pretty much touched on that. Well, generally speaking, I would say that unemployment or jobs tied to the high level of informality, and there's a certain dynamism. I think that that is the big question for everyone. One of the items that the report touches on is how digitalization is changing the type of jobs. If you go out in the streets in Latin America and the Caribbean, and it's obvious that it's full of delivery vehicles, another type of job that didn't exist in the past. Now, Mexico is one of those cases in which the issue of formalizing jobs has been central. And there's a huge advantage there. You can see who works, how much they work, and we have to try to see how social protection can be extended to those that have jobs that we thought were in the informal sector. Thank you, Martin. Now, some questions from Colombia. These are country questions, and perhaps I can try to address them jointly. First, Carolina Salazar, and her question is, in the figures, what has been the impact of COVID-19 on inclusion? And Mr. Lopez from Portfolio says, in a number of countries such as Chile, Peru, or Argentina, what has been the perspective for this year regarding forecasts in January? Why in Colombia, what is the likelihood of there being a lower growth than what is forecast in the report? Let's start with the forecast. If we look at all these forecasts, I would say we should take them with some caution, because this is a different crisis from anything we've seen before, in which you've got on the supply side, people aren't going out to work or working less, and there has been a reduction of demand as well. So the first thing is we should not place too much attention on the numbers. We all know that Colombia has a pretty sound situation that has greater fiscal space than other countries, that has a good sound tradition of economic management. And so those forecasts have already priced that in and taken into account those uncertainties better than other countries. Now, to put this in a very simple way, the level of poverty, the net level of poverty, is lower. If we don't have the 20 million people, getting close to 30 million people are poor now. Even though that is a lower stock of impoverished people, it's an unequal distribution throughout the country. There are countries in which there has been a rise in poverty, others in which it has dropped. But in the end of the report, there's a breakdown country by country on that. Thank you, Martin. And I would just like to pause here and then comment to the journalists taking part. In the interest of time, it's not going to be possible to answer all of the questions because we have many questions, country questions, and so I would invite you to consult the report. But I would like to go to a question, Martin. This one is from Enrique Arturo. The question is, how will the digital ecosystem influence or have bearing on economic growth in 2021 for the region? The new digital ecosystem, yes. What influence will it have? Please proceed. First, to be prepared to enter that ecosystem is very different from country to country. We used 8 indicators: how many people have access to the internet, how many people have smartphones, how much internet costs, how well distributed it is, and depending on the capacity, how many information systems are being accessed by people, and the unicorns. So those are technology companies that grow really quickly, that rise to $1 billion worth without going public. Now, there's a huge dynamism. Now, as far as the ecosystem goes, there are very different ecosystems throughout the region. You have to look at the region. This should be the priority of enhancing the ecosystem, but there are 3 areas which are key. Decades of economic reform has only made it possible to move forward to a certain degree. Now you got the financial system. If Latin America has very low levels of financial inclusion for developing countries, and you have a few large banks that dominate. Technological companies can bring about change in that. The second area, as I mentioned, is jobs, greater flexibility, because now you can work in a number of things through different platforms, and there is more potential for formalization. It's This is an economic policy issue of creating less precarious jobs. We have to see greater formalization of the job sector in Latin America. Now, how many attempts of integration throughout Latin America? More than anywhere else. And the proportion of our international trade regarding our product isn't very good. Now, as far as internet does make it possible for us to integrate with markets in a more direct way in services, goods, and so that will be the third transformation. Thank you very much. Thank you, Martin. We do have one more question. You were speaking about power and electricity. Now, a question about Politica Online. Now that we're speaking about the power sector, I would like to know if you have reassessed your perspectives of reform for electric laws and what your perspective on that is, please. Once again, this is a very germane question, but we don't do detailed country analyses. This is a 50-page report, a small one, a regional one. Now, we illustrate through different examples what that or this problem is in a given country, or results from this and that country. But this is not a detailed report about any country in particular. It speaks of the region to say that, well, these are the problems, and we hope that with our country teams, we can continue to engage in a more in-depth dialogue on these detailed matters. Thank you, Martin. Well, I would also like to remind you of the hashtag of this Perspectiva LAC. And just to conclude our conference, press conference, Martin, I would like to know if you have any final thoughts, reflections you would like to share with us regarding this report. I would like to go back to what we said in the beginning. A year ago, Jessica, we were thinking about what was coming down the pike, and we had certain naive optimism that after a couple of weeks of lockdown, we would emerge. But it's very clear that we first have to learn how to operate basically with COVID to be more efficient than we have been with our containment policies. Oftentimes, the policies that were rolled out didn't work as well as we thought they would. Now, perhaps they weren't done exactly the way it was thought, to have people locked up where there is no access to water, for example. That keeps people from going out to work. And for those people working in the informal market, the lockdown measures actually worked against them. So the first issue is we are still in the midst of this pandemic. We have to learn how to have economic equality and to return to growth. We also have a fiscal challenge that's quite large. We have to strike a balance between continuing to help people where that's needed, and there are many people who do still need that, and there are many challenges in that regard. At the same time, we know that we need for health systems that work, that kids be able to go back to work. It's hard to raise taxes when we have to protect jobs. We have to reconcile all of these different factors. How are we going to do that? Now, the third issue, stressed in the report, moving forward, looking forward, that is the title of the report itself, renewing with growth. What opportunities are there? We know this is a difficult situation. There are a lot of things working against us. Separate the labor market and high indebtedness and other aspects. And this report talks about speeding up the digital world. There are good perspectives for Latin America and the Caribbean, I do believe. Thank you very much, Martin. And with those thoughts that you share with us, we all of the people listening in on us, and the hashtag is Perspectivas LAC. Thank you very much for being here. And I am the press spokesperson for the bank. It was a pleasure for me to be here with you. And